Hari Om, and welcome on behalf of Chinmaya Mission UK to this final evening talk, Shelter in Prayer by Brahmacharini Shripriya Chaitanya. In the past 3 days, we have beautifully been taken through all elements of prayer. And this evening, we look forward to understanding how the mind and intellect can be used in prayer. If you have missed any of these talks, you can catch up as they are on Chinmaya Mission UK's YouTube channel and Facebook page. The events this week are all to raise funds for the NHS Charities Together COVID-19 appeal. Yesterday, Shripriya Ji told us that we should not have arrogance or pride in service, especially in giving, as that is short-sighted and we do not know when we will be on the receiving end. With that statement, I make a final appeal to all watching to give generously to those heroes that are serving us. All funds will go to NHS Charities Together appeal. This week, we still have many events with a devotional concert tomorrow at 7 p.m. Be sure to tune in. All details can be found on our website, chinmayamissionuk.org. Finally, on behalf of everybody listening and tuning in, I would like to thank Shripriya Ji for these beautiful talks and helping us to enrich our prayers. I would also like to thank all sevaks and volunteers who have made these talks and events this week possible. Now, I humbly request Shripriya Ji to begin this evening's talks. Hari Om.
Hari Om. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Sadashiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Samasta Jana Kalyane Niratam Karunamayam Namami Chinmayam Devam Sadgurum Brahma Vidvaram. Prayer is a means for us to connect with the divine, with the infinite, with God, who is of a blissful nature. And by making that connection, we ourselves are able to experience that bliss, that peace, which is that nature. We are able to experience it more. And in these past 3 days, what we have seen is what is prayer? How do we understand it? Who can pray? Where do we pray? Why do we pray? And finally, yesterday we started looking at how we can engage in this practice of prayer. And if we think of prayer as a means for us to make a connection, a means for us to develop and establish a relationship, then what we want to do is we want to use all aspects of our personality in order to do this. And yesterday, what we saw was how we can use our body in physical worship of God, how we can use our body in service to the world around us, with the understanding that we have been given the privilege to serve not the world, not people, but the privilege to serve God. And we also saw how we can use our senses to engage in this practice of prayer as well. The challenges that we face in life, sometimes they are unknown before we come across them. Generally speaking, we are unaware of what's coming. And if we are aware, if we have an idea, then it's not that we can strictly define that challenge or know when it's going to come to an end. And the situation that we're currently facing is a perfect example of that, because we cannot predict when this situation will come to an end. There are people who are working to figure that out based on science, based on their understanding and their interpretation of data. But for those of us who are going through this situation, we cannot say when it will come to an end. And when we are facing such challenges, the extent of which we are unaware, our effort to face them, our effort to deal with those challenges, includes this means of prayer. And if we want to think of it how we had first defined it on the first day, that prayer means asking for help when it's needed. Because there come many times in our lives when we do need help. We need assistance in facing whatever is in front of us or facing whatever is within us. And to live intelligently is also to be able to recognize one's own need for help and to ask for that support whenever it's required. And it's not only when things are difficult or when things are going wrong, but it's even whilst we are facing that challenge, even before we begin to engage in any situation. And this is what we find, that in most traditions, prayer is very much a part of daily life. If we look within the Vedic tradition, Vedic way of thinking, prayer is very much part of one's life. Even if we look at it on sort of a micro scale, right? On a day-to-day basis, there is a prayer for when you wake up. There is a prayer for before you put your feet on the floor. There are prayers to be said when you are bathing. There are prayers to be said when you eat your breakfast. There are prayers to be said when you start work. There are prayers to be said when you're studying, when you're journeying, when you're traveling, when you are returning, when you are going to sleep. There are prayers for the beginning, during the day and at the end of the day. There are various things that we say in prayer. And the effect of this, the effect of actually practicing this, is to make me constantly aware of God and also of my own self-effort. One is that when I pray, that prayer is directed towards God. And the understanding is that God is governing this entire universe. God is blessing all the efforts that we make, all the actions that we perform. And God is facilitating the experience of results of our actions, the experiences that we have according to whatever actions we've done in the past. When we pray, we are reminded of this. When we pray, we are also reminded that we are responsible for engaging in situations, for putting forth self-effort. And that effort doesn't have to be anything but my best, not even the best. It just has to be my best. How can I strive in a way that will give me a positive experience afterwards? It is by, one, remaining aware of this divine presence, and two, making sure that in whichever way I strive, it is that I'm giving my best. It is that by remaining aware of God and of the world around me, I'm able to strive selflessly. And through prayer, through this acknowledgement, through this awareness of God's presence, I'm able to surrender the actions that I perform and the results that I receive. And this by itself can make a huge difference to our mindset and the way that we experience the world. By surrendering our control, which actually, really speaking, we don't have in the first place, over fruits of action, we are relaxed, we're peaceful. So prayer has this effect in our day-to-day life. And sometimes when we are encouraged to start praying, to start developing a relationship with God, we feel that it's a bit artificial. This is often, something that we hear, that, okay, I'm trying, but it doesn't feel genuine. It doesn't feel authentic for me to be reaching out to God or talking to God or praying to God. And the fact is that that may be the case at first. But that's also the case in a lot of our relationships that we have with other people. Before we really get to know people, generally speaking, we are all presenting a version of ourselves. For most people, not for everyone. But there is some artifice in developing relationships or in starting relationships. And as we become closer to people, as we get to know them better, that artifice drops and we are ourselves. And then there is depth in our relationships. So prayer is to remind us that God is present at all times and that God is always part of our life. And if we can remember this, then our entire life becomes prayerful. It's not that, okay, when I wake up, I say a prayer and then I do what I have to. Then I come to the next activity and I say a prayer, and then I do what I have to. Then I eat, so I say a prayer, but then I eat how I want, what I want. That prayer should not be disengaged from our actions and the way that we're living. The idea is that prayer starts to mold the way that we live so that our life itself starts to become prayerful. And what this means is we start living a life that is in accordance with dharma. That is going to bring unity, that is going to bring harmony to us and to the world around us. And when we understand that it is God who is the source of dharma, then when I live in prayer, I am connected to God always. And I cannot do adharma. If I want to live a prayerful life connected to God, I know that any adharma that I perform, in other words, anything that causes conflict, anything that is purely selfish, anything that is not in accordance with what scriptures advise, when I do that type of action, I will not be pleasing God. I will not be living in a way that is acceptable to the scriptures, to God, because I'm going against God's very nature. So prayer through speech gives us these reminders. So when I wake up and I pray to Mother Earth before I put my feet on the ground, I'm remembering to be grateful. I'm remembering to be respectful to the world, to people around me. When I pray before I eat, and I remember that God is functioning as that digestive fire to help my body process that food, and that everything is in fact nothing but that truth, then I'm reminding myself that eating is not just for pleasure. It can be an enjoyable experience, but the purpose of eating is to sustain my body. The purpose of eating is to allow me to function in a way that lets me live in this world in a dharmic way. Just imagine if we could think in this way, that everything I take in through my senses is an offering to God. How different would our life be? What I eat, what I see, what I listen to, what I smell, what I feel. When I receive those sensory inputs, in actual fact, who is receiving them is God who is present within me. If we could think in this way, our life would be different. We wouldn't have to engage in so many of the things that we do. So prayer in this way, when we pray through speech, it is to give us these reminders that ultimately helps us to live our entire life in this way. And yesterday we touched on the practice of japa. So japa is to take a specific mantra and to repeat it. So what is the idea behind this? The idea behind japa when you say a word, when you hear a word, a specific meaning comes to mind, right? So somebody says, dog. An image of a dog will come to your mind. Somebody says apple, an apple will come to your mind. Somebody says rain, rain will come to your mind. Right? So whenever we hear words, or we read words, or we speak words, it has an effect on what we think. In other words, it conjures up the meaning of the word for us. If I say God, what comes to your mind? What comes to our mind? Does anything come? For some people, it's just a word. It doesn't mean anything. For some people, maybe an image will appear. For some people, maybe an idea will appear, a teaching, a quality. So different things are associated with this word. But the idea with japa is to establish and strengthen the connection between the word and the meaning. And when we say the word that we will be taking, or words, plural, will be directly calling God or indirectly depicting or indicating, rather, this divine principle, this divine presence, universal presence, whatever you want to call it. So we are strengthening the relationship between God, God's name, and what we should understand by that. And what we want to understand is that God means this entire totality plus the consciousness principle that is functioning through it. When we do japa, we take the name of any deity. So you may say, Om Namah Shivaya, Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama, etc. What you are doing is, in your own mind, recalling that name, but also recalling what you want to understand by that name, so that this connection between the word and its meaning becomes strengthened. And sometimes we ask, does it have to be in Sanskrit? Some people love Sanskrit. Some people come out in rashes at the mention of Sanskrit. They're allergic to Sanskrit. So very often we have this question that, oh, Sanskrit, I can't understand, it's so difficult to even pronounce. Not even to read Sanskrit, to read the transliteration in the Roman script, people find difficult. Why can't it just be in English? Why can't I just read the translation? It's much easier. So we can repeat prayers in English, but Sanskrit, the language itself, has its own power. And so even if we are just repeating the words in the right way, we are benefiting. The practice of japa and of chanting has an incredibly potent effect on the mind. So even if we just pronounce the words, it's beneficial, but if we understand the meaning, it's even more helpful. Because this word mantra itself, mantra means that which protects us when we think of it, when we dwell on it, when we inquire into it. So that mantra itself can become a protection for the mind, but when we understand the meaning, that is even more of a protection. And mantra means that which speaks to us. It is telling us something. And if we want to find out what it's telling us, we have to inquire into the meaning. So this is the idea behind japa, that we are trying to remember God and to strengthen this connection. And we are dedicating exclusive time, right? When we do japa, some people will do japa all the time. So while they're driving, while they're walking, while they're doing other things. But when we take exclusive time to do japa, then it is working towards establishing and strengthening that relationship with God. So when we start off, when we're not used to this practice, then we start off doing it loudly. So we speak the words. Then as our mind gets used to that and we are able to concentrate, because the purpose of pronouncing it loudly is to help my mind focus there. Once the mind becomes focused, then we can start to say it quietly. Quietly means that only I should be able to hear it. Even if someone's sitting next to me, it should be that quiet. And then when the mind becomes focused enough, then japa can be done mentally. And the effect of that is the mind becomes focused, it becomes concentrated, and it develops greater clarity, greater stillness, which is going to be helpful in all areas of our life, not just in spirituality and conducting this inquiry. It is helpful for every aspect. So in this way, our speech can be used to engage in prayer. Now, how can the mind be utilized? So the mind can be used to think of God. The mind has to be involved in all the other activities, right? We're not doing puja, service, we're not doing worship or serving or listening or speaking mindlessly. That is exactly what we don't want to do. So the mind is involved in all the other practices. But if we want to just use the mind, then how can we use it? In other words, we're not using our body or our senses in any particular way, but we just want to engage the mind in prayer. So if we think a little bit, what is the nature of the mind? What does the mind do? So the mind is the seat of emotions, right? It's where we experience all our emotions. It's where we experience joy, sorrow, fear, anxiety. We experience all these things in the mind. The mind is also where our likes and dislikes are. So all our preferences that we have for everything. So for objects, we like particular brands over others. We like particular types of things. So there is all these likes. And dislikes also we have. We don't like certain things. This is all in the mind, these preferences. So this is what the mind does. Now, if we think, what is it that troubles us in our mind? Where do we experience sorrow? What is the origin of that experience? Where does it arise from? What we find is that the stronger our preferences are, the stronger our likes and dislikes are, the greater sorrows they produce. And this is because, although to some extent we can make our own environment, our own situations conducive, we are not in control of the external world. We see this. This is constantly being reinforced in our lives. And so if we have very strong preferences, and yet we cannot control the external world, those preferences will constantly be, disappointed. So I like something, and that expectation that that liking leads to will be disappointed. I dislike something, and the expectation that arises from that dislike will be disappointed. So these likes and dislikes give rise to desire, anger, greed, delusion, pride, envy. These all arise in our mind. And their origin is attachment. When our mind becomes attached, when it starts to think that particular things or people or situations are a source of happiness, and that we can only be happy when we have those particular things, then all those other experiences are produced in our mind. So where does attachment come from? Where does attachment arise from? Attachment arises from constant brooding, constant thinking of those things or those people or those situations. This idea we see in the Bhagavad Gita, in the second chapter, when Bhagavan describes the ladder of fall. He says it begins with brooding over objects. That leads to attachment. That leads to desire, etc., etc. So when we constantly keep thinking about things, and we keep thinking, oh, it's such a good thing, it would be so nice to have in my life, it would make me happy, it would make everyone else happy. When we keep brooding and exposing our mind to these objects, then we create attachment in our mind. Attachment will lead to desire, will lead to all those other experiences of anger, greed, etc., etc. And that is where we suffer. So when we're thinking of prayer, what we want to do is, with our mind, think of God and develop an attachment not to the world or to people or to places, to situations. We want to use the mind to become attached to God, to become attached to the company of holy people, of saints, to become attached to satsang, to being in good ideas that uplift us. And sometimes people say, well, we keep saying that we shouldn't have attachment, so why should we become attached to satsang? First of all, we need to let go of our negative attachments. So there's no use saying, I'm going to go from having all sorts of selfish attachments to having no attachments at all. It's not going to work. It's not going to happen. We need to replace those negative attachments, or attachments to limited things, to finite things. We need to replace that with attachment to satsang, to company of saints, to the scriptures, to God. That is where we need to become attached. And how do we do it? Just as attachment to other things arises from constantly brooding over them, if we can set aside specific time to only think of God without engaging in any other activity, then we can also create attachment in our mind. So we take a specific time and we say, okay, for the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, I'm only going to think of God. This is where, for a mind that is unused to doing this, that particular form or deity will be very helpful. So you can focus on specific things to think of. And it's not that you're just drawing a blank. You sit down and say, okay, I'm going to think of God, and absolutely nothing comes to mind. So this is where the form helps, that we can take the name, we can take the form, we can take qualities, we can take stories, and just dwell on these. And if thinking of the name or the form is difficult, then start with thinking of the stories of the Lord. That will be easier. Then you can start focusing on what are the qualities? What do we see about the character that is depicted of the Lord? Compassion, patience, love, all of those things. Then, when the mind is used to that and can focus, then we can move on to just the form of the Lord. Then to the name. This is why listening comes first, because if you want to remember anything, if you want to remember stories, if you want to remember the form of the Lord, you need to know what they are. And how will you know? When we listen in satsang, then we will know. So when we listen to the Bhagavatam, when we listen to the Ramayana, when we listen to Devi Purana or Shiva Purana or all these stories, Mahabharata, etc., we hear stories of the Lord, and these can be what we take and what we remember. If we can't see God's qualities directly, identify what it is about saintly people that makes them saintly. Those are the qualities of the Lord. And if we were thinking of the form, so many details are given in all these different scriptures about how to picture the Lord. You can start from the feet and end up at the head. You can start from the head and end up at the feet. But so much detail is given for this purpose, so that we have so much to think of, and it provides material for our mind to start forming an attachment. So there is the specific form, there is also the universal form that is described in so many places, in the Purusha Sukta, in Bhagavatam, again, in Ramcharitmanas. So many descriptions are given. And that's to help us understand that not only does God, that my deity, appear in that form that I love, but this entire world is nothing but their manifestation. So we can think of the universal form also, that the clouds in the sky are like the hair of the Lord. The blue of the sky is like the infinite nature of the Lord. All the trees and all the grass on the earth are like the small hairs that cover the Lord's body. These descriptions are given to allow us to, everywhere we look, make a connection. And finally, sometimes just that namasmaranam, just the remembrance of the name, is done with the mind. Once Pujya Gurudev was doing some work somewhere, and he wanted to call someone from another room. And that person's name was Krishna. So he called loudly, Krishna, Krishna, he called. Someone else was in the room with him, and he showed him. He said, this is what should happen when you call the Lord's name. And he had goosebumps all up his arm. That even if you just take the name of the Lord, that connection is so strong that automatically that response takes place. And it will happen if we give exclusive time like this. So this is on a particular form. if we want to think of the Lord as totality, then what we practice with our mind is upasana. And the idea is, just as because the Lord is infinite, we can invoke God in every part of creation. So in an idol, but it also means that in my own body, I should be able to invoke the Lord. So when our identification is less with our body and more with our mind, then we can use our mind to invoke God. And there, what we are understanding or how we are thinking is that this mind itself is the Lord. This mind itself is God. So I take my mind and I use it as a part of creation in which I'm invoking God. And in that, I see non-difference with God. So I'm still acknowledging that that mind is there. It's not that I reached non-duality. I'm acknowledging that that mind is there, but as part of the totality. And as part of the totality, it's not different. Just as my finger is different from my palm or my arm, but it's still part of my whole body. It is like the wave saying, I am one with the ocean. In that way, we can take this mind and in this mind understand God. Now, for whom will this be possible? It will be possible for someone whose mind has been prepared, for someone whose mind is calm, for someone whose mind has become still. If there is a lot of agitation, it will not be possible. And this is also how prayer in general works. If I understand that my mind is part of the whole, the total mind, then naturally what I enter will affect the total. So when I utter a prayer, even if it's silently within, it will still have an effect on the total. And when many individual minds come together, there can be an even greater impact on the total, because a greater part, as though, is engaging in prayer, and therefore it can have a bigger ripple in the total. So this is how we use our mind. Finally, what we want to see is how our intellect can be used in prayer. How do we pray with our intellect? So firstly, everything else should also be done intelligently with understanding, right? That physical worship, service, listening, prayer through speech, japa, this prayer through the mind, everything has to be done with understanding. But if we're only using the intellect, then the prayer will be in the form of knowledge. The prayer will be to know God as He is. This is what intellectual prayer, we can say, will look like. To know the true nature of God. This is the culmination. How God is one and His nature is unchanging. We think of God differently because our understanding of God depends on how we understand ourselves. So if we want to understand who God truly is, we have to understand what is our true identity. We have to discover our own true nature, because God Himself will say we are not different. If we know where to look, we will find plenty of these assurances which tell us that that divine, infinite presence, what I want to call God, I may call by different names, is not different from me. I have to understand myself properly. How will it happen? I can prepare myself by living a prayerful life, developing a relationship with God, engaging in this self-inquiry, listening to the teaching of the scriptures from a teacher, reflecting on that, meditating on that, and becoming fixed in that knowledge. Then the prayer is one of oneness. Then the prayer is in the form of remembering that God is not different from me. And then everything that such a person does becomes a blessing for others. They are not seeking blessings. Everything that they do, everything that they say becomes a blessing. And they can still enjoy praying to God. They can still enjoy that relationship with God even more, because they have understood God and I are not separate. God and I are not different. We are one. Now, when we're looking at our current situation, what is required? Many things are required, and all of the practical measures that we need to take, we are hearing about. We are hearing about from experts, we are hearing about from the government who are giving their own advice. So we are aware of what we need to do in terms of how we are transacting, how we are living in this world. But in terms of what we have spoken about, what is called for? Not just today, but over these 4 days, 4 evenings. So all of it, living a life of prayer, serving people around us in whatever way that we can. It doesn't have to be physically, it can be in other ways. If we are serving physically, then that is wonderful. Not only that, not only living in prayer, serving, but developing a relationship with God, remembering that God is there. And if we can, to recognize and remember God's true nature, our true nature. How can we help? We can, again, there are practical ways for us to help, for us to serve. In relation to prayer, prayer will help us to become strong. Prayer will help us to become understanding, to become strong within ourselves. And when we have understood how, we can invoke the totality, and then we can pray, then we can act and make a difference to the world around us. We can come together to pray for the sake of totality. And prayer for all includes prayer for me. Everyone will benefit. It's not that if I pray for others, I'm excluding myself from that. So, if we want to know how we can make a difference, if we want to know how we can make a change, for change to happen in the world around me, it must start with me. When I myself am able to make a change, then I have begun to make a change in the world around me. So we don't need to give the responsibility anywhere else. We can take it upon ourselves to do our best, to do what we can to make a difference in the world. To, as I said, come together in prayer and to give out those positive thoughts of support, of love to those who need it. So that's what we will do now. We will come together in prayer, and the prayers will be displayed on your screen. So please join me in this prayer. We will first chant the Mrityunjaya mantra, then we will pray for everyone, for the whole world, for our community. We will pray for understanding, and we pray for peace. Please join me. Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanat Mrityormukshiyamamritaat. Om Sarvesham Swasti Bhavatu, Sarvesham Shantir Bhavatu, Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu, Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu, Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramayah, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschit Dukkha Bhag Bhavet, Asato Ma Satgamaya, Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. So thank you to those of you who have joined us for these series of 4 talks. As you know, they have been conducted in aid of this NHS Charities Together COVID-19 Urgent Appeal. And it is a way for us to support the community. Today, as many of you have been doing every week, going out at 8 o'clock and expressing your appreciation, your support for health workers, for people who are helping things to run smoothly, even in this situation. And it's a wonderful thing to do. But there are substantial ways in which we can help. It's wonderful to express our appreciation and support. It's wonderful to help in whatever way that we can. So that includes the way that we live. It includes being responsible so that we reduce the burden, the potential burden on those whom we are seeking to support. So I pray that you are all able to do that. And if you can, of course, monetary, financial support is appreciated by everyone in this world. So if we can come together to donate however much you feel you can, however much you feel you should, there has already been a very encouraging collection made just in these past few days. So I encourage all of you to give as much as you feel, and let us support those who are going out there and quite literally risking their lives to serve the community, to help people who are suffering, and express our gratitude, our appreciation, our support for them in all these different ways. So, with prayers for everybody's good health, for your well being, wish you all well. Hari Om.